Right. And I have access to share my slides, so we're banging on all cylinders. Great. Thank you for that warm introduction, Heather. Great to see so many familiar faces and also some new ones today as well. Um, as was requested, so today what I'm talking about to you about is how to publish your book based upon your research. Um, So before I go into that, I'm going to give a brief reminder about who I am. So as Heather's already said, I'm a lecturer in social policy. I also co-lead the Aging Futures Research Group at the University of Bristol. So it's kind of a group we're trying to consolidate our efforts about who does aging research at the University of Bristol. It's primarily based in the School of Social Science, Faculty of Social Sciences and Law, where I'm based in School of Policy Studies, and my co-lead, who's Helen Manchester, does a lot of work on aging technology, also kind of aging creatively too. But we have people from arts and humanities, natural sciences, biological sciences, medicine, health sciences as well. I'm also the former BSG ERA chair, although going a few back now, because I believe Ireland is the current chair, if I remember correctly. Yes, and then Junji is going to be the incoming chair or chair from July, and Heather's kind of outgoing right now as well. So a few generations of chairs assembled here today. Um, my background, although I am a gerontologist, I think is what we've come to call in the last few years kind of a incidental or accidental gerontologist, where we start off in different fields or disciplines as well. So I originally studied social anthropology as an undergraduate and for a master's degree, and eventually did a PhD in health sciences and science technology studies at the University of East Anglia, which was an ethnography of people with dementia using technology as part of a randomized controlled trial. But more broadly, our research kind of explores how technology shapes and indeed in turn helps shapes my experiences of practices and assemblages of caring and aging, right? So that feedback will between how technology shapes caring and aging, but also how experiences of caring and aging also shape the role of technology in our lives too. As Heather has already helpfully plugged, about 2 weeks ago, almost to the day, um, Kate Hamblin and I, my co-editor, and I published a book with the Bristol University Press, and particularly an imprint of Bristol University Press called Policy Press, um, called Care Technologies for Aging Societies, an International Comparison. It's an edited volume published as part of the Sustainable Care series, which will talk about all those different facets in a little bit more in detail. It's also one of the shorts they have there. So it's not a full-length monograph. It's a bit shorter of a thing. But we chose that specifically due to who we want to reach with this book, which is not just other academics, but also people in policy and practices as well. Um, so what the book actually combines is, again, it's an edited volume that compares how technologies are being used to support older people globally in social long-term aged care systems. It's tricky doing the comparison when it comes to different kind of care systems because social care is very much is an artifact of British um, social policy, whereas long-term and aged care systems are kind of what's used in other countries, including the ones we've selected for this volume. So for the volume, we have contributing chapters that explore the role of technologies in supporting older people in England, Canada, Australia, Japan, and Germany. We have, and to go in those kind of 5 individual chapters for those different countries, we also have a preceding chapter, an introductory chapter, which defines the key concepts for the collection. So, what is care? What does it mean for us in this chapter? What is technology? What does it mean for us throughout the volume? It also explains why we selected these particular 5 countries based on different welfare regime typologies. So that's kind of, for those of you who don't know, and I didn't know until I kind of became a lecturer in social policy, what that meant. Kind of think about how different forms of social policy and social support systems are based on who the different role of state and other actors are. So, for instance, the liberal or neoliberal even systems of Anglophone countries like Canada, Australia, and England predominantly. Um, East Asian welfare regime of Japan, which focuses on kind of productivism, collectivism, and other shared ideologies, and Germany, which is this kind of corporate conservatism approach, which has very little state involvement sort of thing and has often involvement more from um, corporate actors instead, like employers, to help provide that kind of social support instead of the state. We've also seen it in divergence from social democratic approaches, which are based more on kind of the Nordic countries, which have a very strong state presence in helping to provide kind of social support structures. And finally, we have a concluding chapter for this volume, which is kind of meant to synthesize the kind of key areas of convergence right? So what were the similarities between England, Canada, Australia, Japan, Germany when it comes to the role of technologies, but also where they differed as well in their scope. So I won't go into any detail about what we found out sort of thing, because the book is available now for you for free. So I encourage you to read it if you want to, if you're interested in looking at this. But what I'm going to discuss today actually is, do I need to write a book? And the short answer is probably not, but doesn't mean you should not. So the question is then, why would you want to write or edit a book? One reason, which I think is probably the strongest reason, is it's a longer form of expression, written expression that can follow and allow for more sustained argumentation or conceptual development than what you might have available, for instance, in a peer-reviewed journal article, right? If you have 6,000 words to 8,000 words, maybe 9,000 to push for some of the really generous qualitative research publications, there may not be a lot of word count to enable you to have kind of a more developed idea of what you want to discuss. Or in the case of our volume right here, we wouldn't be able to have a kind of discussion of a variety of different countries without becoming very reductionistic about what the policy context is and what has been done in practice when it comes to technologies within care settings. So in our case, a book allowed us to have not only that kind of comparative aspect and be able to have it across a wide range of different countries instead of having to be very reductionistic into what we could include, both content-wise, both of the number of countries we could include, also we could expand upon too by having, in our case, 55,000 words. And also, people might also choose to write a book, especially for a single-authored monograph, based on their own research sort of thing, if they're part of a discipline which prescribes to a more kind of literary or narrative approaches to academic writing. So for instance, people who engage in ethnographic research may not necessarily have the traditional introduction, literature review, methods, discussion, of findings, discussion, and conclusions sort of thing. They might have more of a story-based approach, where they're actually telling stories based upon their interlocutors or participants and how they view the world, rather kind of more kind of academic, kind of tried and true approach to presenting those kind of ideas. So a book often gives you a lot more space to have that kind of more creative literary approach to presenting that kind of material. Thinking more individualistically for your own career expectations, depending on what discipline you're in, there may be an expectation that you will publish a book at some point in time for promotion or progression. This will vary from discipline to discipline, and even within gerontology, it depends on how you're kind of positioning yourself there. So if you're more in kind of the quantitative methodology side of things, or statistics, epidemiology, perhaps, it probably won't be an expectation. If you tend to be more on kind of the humanistic or social science side of things, it may be. Keep in mind that many people in gerontology come from other disciplines originally as well, like sociology, anthropology. There may be expectation that you will produce a book at some point in time based upon the sustained contribution you've made to that field. But that's something you can discuss with a mentor, either at your institution, if you're based at one. I don't know, not everyone on the call is, or with a mentor you might be able to have. For instance, British Society of Gerontology, the ERA group offers a mentoring service and system, which may be able to help you, give you some kind of proactive engagement about thinking about your own career trajectory and where a book is appropriate for your own kind of ambitions. And kind of a final kind of reason why one might want to write a book is merely because they just want to write a book. I feel like the idea of perhaps seeing their names inscribed on a spine of a book, kind of for a sort of vanity project sort of thing, or just because the idea that everyone has a story in them to write sort of thing. The idea that something that's motivated them beyond kind of the methodological way of what to represent kind of knowledge production or kind of career ambition sort of thing. They're just saying that they feel motivated to write a book for some other kind of personal reason instead. So let's say you've decided to write a book. Fantastic, great. I fully support that. You might have a few questions about where do you begin. So should you write a proposal first, or should you write the book first? Should you target specific publishers, or should we cast a very wide net? And if you do identify a relevant publisher, how should you contact the commissioning editors there who might be responsible for actually getting you a contract? So for the first question about writing a book first or writing a proposal first, there are pros and cons to either one. First and foremost, writing a book is a laborious task. It takes loads of time, months, if not years. It took us 2 years to write this relatively short book, for instance. Um, Once you have written a book, if you've written the book first without doing a proposal and having a contract agreed before, there's no guarantee that a publisher will be interested in publishing it, right? So you might have written this, what you think is a beautiful piece of work, and it very well may be, but if no one has agreed to publish this sort of thing, it may never see the light of day beyond kind of your own computer or your close family and friends who may um, obligate to read it. That said, even if a kind of academic publisher doesn't want to publish it, there are still other opportunities to publish your work, through self-publishing, for instance, which is really common nowadays, and for more kind of trade publications. Um, that said, if you decide to go do the self-publishing route for academic works, keep in mind that that approach does not have as much kind of capital within academia when it comes to, for instance, promotion or even trying to secure your next kind of contract or grant as well. Um, there's still much more emphasis on working with a university press or traditional academic publisher like Routledge, Palgrave, Bergen, for instance, when it comes to publishing your work. Also, if you're working with a popular press instead of going academic press, for instance, something like Penguin, um, not only does it often require the full manuscript, but you also might need an agent as well before they even consider looking at your piece of work, sort of thing. So again, not to rule out this as an option, but just to know that there are caveats associated with writing a book first. If you do decide to write a book first, and again, that may be required for you if you decide to go during the popular press route, like publishers like Penguin, for instance, then you will still probably need to answer a few key questions you would normally answer on a proposal anyways, which is, why is your book timely and important now? Why are you the best placed to write it, or edit it if you're editing it as a volume? And also, what books are currently on the market with a similar topic, right? So one that tells you about marketability, is this actually important enough where actually people are writing about it as it is? And also, what makes yours distinctive from what already on the market as well? So you still need to be aware of and have responses to those questions, even if you do write the book first when you're approaching publishers. However, in academia, step in first, you tend to write a proposal first. Um, and this is great in that it allows you to shop your idea around different publishers, to see if anyone is interested in the book, or at least your idea for the book before you actually write it. And again, as I mentioned on the last slide, writing a book is very laborious, takes a lot of time. So it can be beneficial to know at the outset if people aren't interested in publishing your book, so you don't necessarily waste time writing it if no one's actually interested in publishing it. Although again, that might be a small consolation to you because obviously it's very important to you. You really want to write the book, but just keep in mind that when it comes to opportunity costs there, especially when it comes to academia, we all have such a finite amount of time to work on writing with our other obligations too. It is unlikely to be published. You may want to reflect on whether or not a book is the right mode of output for your work if no one's interested in publishing it. That said, let's assume that they are interested in publishing it. Generally, publishers will have a required template for a proposal. It will vary slightly from publisher to publisher. And indeed, if you go from publisher to publisher looking at who might be interested in your book, you might need to work on several different formats before you find the right publisher. Also, as part of the proposal process, some publishers may also require a sample chapter. Not all of them do. But if they do, typically it's the first chapter of what will be the completed volume, which may be an introduction chapter if it's an edited volume, or maybe kind of more kind of the background methods if it's more kind of a research monograph along with the proposal. But again, not all publishers do. For instance, Bristol University Press, who I worked with on the most recent book, did not require any sample chapters as part of the proposal process. But again, that does vary. And again, it will be stipulated in the proposal form whether that's required or not. Once you decide to go down whatever you want to go down, whether you're writing the book first and then go share it with publishers, or you're writing a proposal first to see if there's any to garner interest in your book, you may decide about how you want to determine what publishers you target. So when it comes to aging-related research, not like gerontology specifically, but aging research more broadly, there are several different publishers which do publish aging research as monographs or edited collections. So Bristol University Press, including Policy Press Imprint within it, which is again who published the book that we just wrote. Routledge also does one as well. Palgrave, Rutgers University Press, and Bergen. And that's a non-exhaustive list. Those are just examples of some that I know. I've been either working with as a reviewer for them, or have been obviously published within my own personal experience. Um, if you come from a book-based discipline where you're expected to write books as part of kind of your tenure or visual promotion and progression within that field, for instance, social anthropology still has that. Some fields of sociology have that as well. Then there are also other publishers that you can draw upon to publish it as a sociology, social anthropology monograph as well, like Oxford University Press, University of Chicago Press, are also available too. Some publishers also have specific series related to aging for you to apply for as well. So not just looking at just the actual publisher itself, university press or trade press or anything, but also within those groups, there often are different kind of series of books which are commissioned as well. So for instance, for Bristol University Press, there's the Aging in Global Context, which I believe used to be edited by Thomas Sharf, who is former president of British Society of Gerontology. Aging in Life course I know is edited by series editor is edited by Judith Phillips at Sterling. Sustainable Care is edited by Sue Yendall at the University of Sheffield. So there's some other examples there. Global Perspective on Aging is at the Rutgers University Press. That's edited by Sarah Lamb. I can't remember where she's affiliated with right now. And Life Course, Culture and Age and Global Transformation is with Bergen, which tends to be more kind of anthropological press based in the United States. That's edited by Jay Sokolovsky as well. So that tends to be more appropriate for people doing kind of more ethnographic aging-related research, whereas the other ones are much more broader within their kind of scope and domain. And I cannot emphasize this enough, series editors, so whether you're talking to Tom, Judith, Sue, Sarah, or Jay, they are invaluable context to discuss your book ideas. I think when you have a series editor in mind, you've identified that's relevant for the scope of your proposed book. They will often give you one-to-one support to work with you to hone your ideas, adapt them, and make sure that what you ultimately submit resembles something that looks like a publishable manuscript. Whereas if you're kind of cold calling Oxford University Press, University of Chicago Press, these are massive international scope presses, so it would be fantastic to get a contract with them. But they are less likely to work with you to develop your ideas and more likely to get desk rejection through working with them as well, if it doesn't quite meet whatever they deem as the needs or their own priorities for publishing at that point in time. Another key point when it comes to targeting specific publishers is you will be reading books and reviewing them to update your introduction, literature review. Look at where the works you're citing are being published and look at how working with those publishers as well, which maybe some ones are mentioned on this slide, but again, these are non-exhaustive. These are just some of the options I know of personally that are out there through my own kind of professional network and links with them. Right, so how do you approach a commissioning editor or series editor once you found out who you want to possibly work with to publish your book? I think first thing to remember is that editors want to publish high quality books, right? That they're not out against you, because otherwise they wouldn't have a job and there wouldn't be a business for academic books if they weren't publishing something, right? So the idea is that be confident when you're approaching them, because you know your project better than anyone else. You know what you're writing better than anyone else, sort of thing. And they will be an informed and engaged audience when it comes to responding to your queries. So do not undersell yourself. Often the best ways to contact commissioning or series editors are first and foremost at conferences. For those of you who don't know on the call, the British Society of Gerontology has its annual conference in Norwich this July. I believe from the 5th through the 7th of July, if my memory serves correct. There will be major academic publishers there. I know Bristol University Press will be there, for instance, but I'm sure other publishers will be there as well. It's a great opportunity during a coffee break, during a lunch, or during any other breaks you may have throughout one of those 2.5 days of the conference to talk to an editor there, discuss your ideas with them, get them in, see what they think about your ideas, see if there's interest in them publishing a book on that topic, and sound it out. Importantly, if that does go well, that conversation, make sure you do follow up and thank them for the time afterwards via email and whatever else you may have agreed during that initial conversation. If you're not going to any conferences this year for a number of reasons, then another really kind of prominent way of contacting people is just sending out a cold email. Again, they're commissioning editors. They're trying to commission works anyway, so they often get a number of emails. So it may take a bit of time for them to respond to you. And that is an advantage of being kind of face to face in the same space as a person. They kind of can't really evade your questions when you're face to face with them, but they will eventually respond to your email request. Um, Most publishers will have contact information based upon subject specific editors listed on their websites. So again, it might be aging, might be gerontology, might be sociology, social anthropology, might be care, health or social care research as well. Depending on how you are positioning yourself and also your career ambitions, but also what you see as the major contribution of your work as well. And once you find the contact details, contact them to express your interest in publishing a book with them. Let them know your name, who you are, career-wise, very tentative title for your book, and also kind of a brief, you know, synopsis or aim of what the book, intends to cover as well for ground, and just as a starting point, and then have a conversation, discussion with them to develop those ideas and see eventually if they offer you to write a proposal. Now let's continue down this little logic model here. Now let's say you've found a publisher, you've contacted them, they've invited you to write a proposal. How do you go about doing that now? So first and foremost is planning proposal. You have to decide what kind of book you want to write. And that could be, again, an edited collection, like what I recently did, where you have contributors who are also providing chapters as well, or you may be writing it entirely as a single authored monograph as well, right? So there are different options available there. But it's important that if you decide you want to do anything besides a single authored monograph, where you'll have contributors, other people writing something, whether it's a chapter with you or individual chapters by themselves, you need to figure out how you're going to include them also in the drafting aspect of the proposal as well. You also need to choose your preferred publisher, right? Again, it may be an academic press, maybe a trade press, but you'll need to eventually choose one to go ahead with when you actually submit your proposal. And indeed, you should only submit it to one at a time and allow them first refusal before you move on to the next one, because you don't want to be in the unfortunate position of having to decline one, because that could be reputational loss for you if you ever want to publish with the person you don't go with in the future. So to go for one at a time. All publishers, so all presses will have information about the proposal process available on their websites. It usually is found under a section called For Authors, but it may be found somewhere else. If you cannot find it in a For Authors section, generally most websites now will have kind of a search function on it where you can kind of type it in there and it will provide results about the proposal there eventually. You might have to sift through it, but generally they are available under For Authors section. If you've not already done so at this point in time, when you identify a press, definitely initiate an informal discussion with the commissioner or series editor to discuss the scope and suitability of your proposed book. It's really important to do that. And if once after that discussion, they've agreed to allow you to propose a book for consideration, confirm a deadline with them for when they need a proposal by. A lot of commissioning editors do not set a deadline for the initial proposal, because again, they are receiving tens, if not hundreds, proposals every month. So they often have usually a decent amount of kind of decent amount of proposals being reviewed at any point in time, sort of thing. So they're happy to kind of take them in as they come in, really. Much different when it comes to post proposal stage, and actually when it comes to manuscript versions. Those are much more deadline dictated. But for the proposal, there may be a deadline that's agreed with your commissioning editor, but there may not be. But just to keep in mind that if there is agreed one, make sure you meet that deadline. So again, every publisher will slightly vary in what they expect you to write about in the proposal. There will be a template that specifies to you what to include. Typically, though, these are kind of 8 areas that they will want you to include. You need to have a title of the book. That's pretty standard, so that shouldn't be too surprising either. You might even have a subtitle as well, but you'll need to have a title of the book. You also need a list of contributing authors or editors, depending on if it's an edited collection or if it's a monograph, with a short bio for each, which usually includes, where the person is in their career. So are they early career? Are they a lecturer? Are they a prof? Short bio about where they are as well, and also where they're located as well. And sometimes they also ask for the citizenship of each individual too, which I think is a bit of a bizarre question to ask. But I think it's because they want to show international scope and spread of the authorship of the authors, because that is an attractive feature when it comes to marketability as well. Again, For point number 3, you'll need to determine what the format is, and that will need to be communicated in the proposal about what kind of book this is going to be. You'll need to include the aims and synopsis of the book. Generally, it's not too long. Generally, it's no more than a few paragraphs for each one of those. But you know, generally really about the length of actually of a conference abstract. 50 words to 500 words is really kind of what you need to provide for the aims synopsis there about what the proposed book will be about. Slightly more detailed, generally about 2,000 words now, you have for a provisional table of contents and a summary for each chapter. Again, this is kind of more of kind of almost an extended abstract for each of the chapters when it comes to actually the total length and how you break it down. But you do need to have then a fairly good idea about what actually you're going to discuss in any given chapter of the book too. So before now, it's kind of been fine to just kind of be a bit woolly, kind of think about, I'm thinking about writing something about this topic and saying this way sort of thing. But actually, as it gets to the proposal stage, you need to be a bit more granular in the detail you want to provide about what the book's actually going to be about and how you're presenting and how you're dividing it into different chapters as well. You also need to provide an estimated word count, so how long it's actually going to be, and including the numbers of figures, tables, charts, or illustrations you may include as well. Generally at the very end, the last section of the proposal asks you for some market research questions. So who's the intended audience? What books have recently been published on the topic? Is there potential for it to be used, for instance, in different courses as kind of a textbook or as a reading resource associated with a different course as well? And then finally, you also want a list of possible people to review the manuscript as well. And as I mentioned before, some publishers may also ask for a draft sample chapter as well, in order to one, it gives them a bit more confidence that you can actually deliver a complete manuscript if you have a decently polished first chapter already ready to go. But again, not all publishers require that. It will be explained in the proposal document, though, the template form, whether it's required or not. And also your commissioning editor will likely also be able to tell you about that too. Right, so you planned a proposal, you've started to write it. How do you submit it? So generally your contact, which again may be a series editor or commissioning editor, will specify how to submit your proposal. Typically, it's just an email attachment. It's nothing too sophisticated. Your proposal will then be reviewed by the editorial and or series team. Again, depends on if you have applied specifically to be published as part of a series or not. If you've just been part of kind of a, discipline-specific kind of offering from a university press, you may just go to the editorial team there. Typically, that team is composed of academics and kind of career editorial staff as well. So people who do editing for a living. After your proposal has been reviewed, your contact will let you know the outcome. They may require revisions, for instance, maybe several revisions or forms of iterations of it before it finally is accepted. But you may need to decide if you're actually happy with the recommendations, because you may decide actually that what they are suggesting actually undermines the integrity of what you view as the contribution of the field to the book, for instance. So you may decide at that point in time that actually you will not carry on with that publisher, you will look elsewhere. But that's a decision you'll need to make individually or as part of a team if you're writing it with co-editors or other contributors as well. Once you get to the point of the proposal being accepted, though, you and the contributors will then be asked to sign a contract. And that will specify key deliverable dates for different versions of the manuscript and also different proofs later on as well. And then that is kind of when everything becomes very real suddenly to you, when actually now you know how formal deadlines you need to meet for the publisher in order for them to meet their production schedule as well. And also whereas the challenges really start to arise as well when it comes to make sure people actually do contribute what they said they're going to contribute on time as well, especially if you're an editor of a collection. So once you have the contract signed for your, the next step, of course, is actually writing the thing. And there are kind of a few kind of things for you to reflect upon now, which again, you will already kind of specified in the proposal, which is for you to remember at this point in time. So one, are you starting from scratch? So as in, is this a wholly new published material? Or are you drawing upon or adapting other material as well? So a lot of early career researchers, well, not a lot, some early career researchers, for example, maybe adapting their doctoral thesis into a research monograph, a single author monograph, or maybe co-authored with a supervisor, for instance. Um, the way that is adapted will vary from publisher to publisher. Your commissioning editor will be able to provide you some guidance, and so are your supervisors, of course, as well, right? They are often very experienced academics in their own right. They'll be able to provide you advice about how to go about adapting that thesis into a monograph as well, if that is the route you're taking. Um, one caveat or thing for you to consider is that some publishers consider theses, especially theses published in British higher education institutions, to be published material because they are available in a repository like eThesis. Um, and they may only allow you to publish a certain amount of material from that without wholly rewriting it or at least adapting it in significant ways. So that's something, again, you might want to discuss with your supervisor if they're co-authoring with you or if they're still your mentor after you finish your PhD, or with your commissioning editor about what is possible there. If you're working from new material, that's less of a concern. Of course, then you have the other issue, which is you have to write a whole new book by yourself without any kind of material to adapt it from. And you also need to determine the structure of your book as well, which is also important for people adapting their PhD, because generally the traditional ILM FDC, which stands for Introduction, Literature Review, Methods, Findings or Results chapter, Discussion, and Conclusion, typically is not how you write a book. You will find that the ILM bit, the Introduction, Literature Review, and Methods, tends to be the first chapter, it's all condensed into one thing. In fact, methods generally is very rarely spoken about in any great detail. You might have something a bit more in notes at the end of the chapter, even, but the emphasis is much more on findings and discussion, kind of as seen as kind of the real heart of the publication of the book. So it's something that is a distinctive way of writing from how you may be used to from writing your thesis, but also how a lot of people write their journal articles as well for peer review. And my advice would be to read other books in your field to see how others have presented their material. So I can tell you that, for instance, for the book that we just had published, we have an introductory chapter, which again, as I said at the beginning of this chat, kind of provides kind of definitions for the key concepts we're using. So what's care, what's technology, what's sustainability, and then also talking about why we're doing international comparison, what we're trying to achieve through that, and why we selected these 5 countries in particular as illustrative of aging societies and broader trends within policy context as well, right? That's kind of it, right? That's kind of the methods, setting the scene, everything, before we go into the proper kind of contributions in the individual country case chapters as well. So that's kind of one way of modeling it, which again, is very different from perhaps the traditional way in which we're kind of indoctrinated to write things for peer review publications elsewhere and how we write theses as well. Another key point, which again you will have specified in the proposal, is: are you writing by yourself or are you writing with other people? So if you're co-editing a volume or co-writing it again as well, research monographs need not be single authored, they can be co-written as well. Then you will need to decide how you will communicate the scope and expectations for individuals contributing chapters, right? So what are you asked them to write? What are they contributing to your book? For what we did with the care technologies for exercising, we actually had kind of almost like a pro forma, breaking down into each chapter into 2 sections, one about kind of the policy context for social care in the country, so whether it's England, Japan, Canada, Australia, or Germany. And then the second section was about the role of technologies within adult social care, long-term care, or aged care systems. Again, what individual country called that kind of different kind of policy area. And we found that really helpful to making sure, one, everything we wanted to be covered in each chapter was covered, but also 2, it really helped us when it came to doing the comparison later on for the concluding chapter of the volume, because we knew where to find the information, quite frankly, and made it a bit easier for us. So that's one thing that make sure you're communicating about, if you are doing an edited volume in particular, how are you communicating expectations to people also writing with you? And part of those expectations, of course, is setting deadlines for draft chapters, which can be difficult, and it's even more difficult when they don't meet the deadlines, but it's something that needs to be done at this point in time too. Indeed, in concert with the publisher as well, right? So the publisher will give you deadlines to submit the manuscript. Working back from the deadlines, when you need to figure out how much time you need as a possible editor of a volume to figure out how long will it take me to collect and collate and compile individual chapters into what looks like an actual book now, or at least a manuscript of a book. Because that can take a lot of time to compile information and edit it into something that actually stands together as a single volume rather than kind of a very patchwork piece of individual contributions instead. So that's just make sure you provide time for that as well if you're going down the route of editing a volume in particular. Speaking of editing, the first bit of editing will be once you have received all the complete version of the manuscript, whether that's you as an editor looking at kind of everyone's contributions, or whether it's your own kind of single authored uh, manuscript for a monograph you might write as well, right? One thing I strongly encourage you to do is before the eventual phase after this, which is kind of peer review, do receive as much informal feedback as you can from peers, whether it's a mentor, former supervisor, people at similar career position to you, right? They need not necessarily be more senior to you. Any feedback you get at this early stage will ultimately not only improve the eventual final output, but it may mean you can help anticipate some of the kind of comments you may receive at peer review as well and how you're going to address them. It also is an opportunity for you to polish your work. And also, if you're editing a volume, polishing the work of contributors. This can be really tricky when it comes to, I feel I work in, and when you're working on it too, the role of technology in nature, for instance, right? Everyone kind of slightly defines it in different ways. But of course, for a volume, you need to have kind of a unified vision for how you're defining it for that piece of work. So for you, as an editor, it may mean you have to kind of fine tune definitional work, conceptual work of other people in that volume to make sure that it is coherent and stands together as a whole rather than as individual pieces. So that is the role of editing at that point in time. Once you feel it is sufficiently ready, or as good as it's going to be for this first pass, anyways, you can then submit the manuscript to your editor. Um, Again, your editor will specify how they want to receive their manuscript. Generally, it can be an email attachment if there aren't too many illustrations or figures. But obviously, as the file size increases, you may need to use something like Google Doc, Dropbox, or something else like, or share drive as well. SharePoint for Microsoft in order to allow them to use to share larger files as well. But again, that will vary from publisher to publisher and also based on the size of the file too. Commissioning editor will specify that to you if it is not specified in your contract. One caveat is that typically when you do submit your manuscript, the actual main text for the book is separate from the figures and tables, which are often sent as separate files as well. The reason why is because they may need to be redrawn by someone in-house at the publisher's thing, especially if you don't have permission from the publisher of the original source. If it's something that you produce from your own analysis, it's not as much of an issue. But also they may need to be resized, rejigged in order to fit into actually the size and format of a book, which may be very different from the typical A4 we're writing on when we're actually writing, in Word. Those are some caveats that are to be considered as well when submitting a manuscript. The good news is once you submit the manuscript, it's off your desk at least for a bit. There's a moment of respite. You can take a break. You can you'll probably have a crash because your energy levels and internal that have kept you going for the last however many months or years has finally coalesced into at least the thing being submitted at some stage and having, what looks and feels like a complete manuscript now. Once it's off your desk, it now goes on to someone else's desk, your commissioning editor. And what they will do is they will arrange a peer review of that manuscript. This may include series editors, again, if that's applicable, if you apply to be part of a specific series, or maybe nominated external peer reviewers. Again, and these may be some of the reviewers you suggested during the initial proposal stage, and maybe other ones that the press already has on file that they've worked on in the past, or other people that maybe recommend to them elsewhere. The reviews are often blinded, so you don't know who's going to be reviewing it, and the reviewers may not know who's written as well. Typically, I think they often do know who's written it, but generally for you as the authors or editors, you may not know who has reviewed it. And the reviews are really tasked with kind of a few kind of key things they need to consider. One, I'm sorry, I said I put this first actually, because it ought not to be the most important thing. But first is evaluating the marketability and desirability of the book, right? So who's the intended audience, what else has been published recently on the topic. Is there competition for the book as well, which again is that last point here is too, but it's kind of related to the marketability there as well. Again, another thing they're really keen about, especially when it comes to a lot of North American based press like Rutgers University Press and Bergen, is there a possibility of the book being adopted for different courses as well? And that's kind of a way of seeing kind of their way of making money off of it too. Uh, Crucially, probably what should have been first in the listing here actually is the content, right? They look at kind of the scholarly engagement, your argumentation, how you're contributing to the field sort of thing, how you're expanding upon knowledge of your chosen discipline, and evaluating that as well. That's kind of, why you're writing the book sort of thing often is to kind of push knowledge forward in some way. So they will also evaluate that too. Um, at the end of the reviewing process, which generally takes 6 to 8 weeks from when the manuscript is submitted, you'll receive at least one reviewer's report, if it is just one reviewer who sent out to, maybe multiple reviewers. And you also may receive an annotated manuscript, right? So what you originally submitted to them may come back to you with track changes and additional comments in the margins about more kind of granular details about how to improve the work. It generally isn't proofreading things because reviewers are not asked to do proofreading. That's seen as something that is separate from the expertise of an academic, something that is done by the editorial team, not by reviewers. Some reviewers do go the extra mile and do that sort of thing, but don't expect to receive that kind of level of feedback. Generally, be more about kind of the academic merit and again the marketability and desirability of the book as well when it comes to commercializing it too. That brings us back to receiving the reviewers' comments. What do you do now? Well, now it's back to editing the book again. So once you receive the reviewers' comments, you'll agree on your deadline to return the revised manuscript. Again, that may have been specified in the original contract, but may need to be moved based upon however long the reviewing process takes. If any deadlines were missed in the meantime, versus getting the first manuscript submitted to the press or publisher, they'll be, again, recommitted at this time once you receive the comments as well. If you're working on an edited volume, you'll need to discuss that timetable with your contributors because it turns out people are really busy and they may be going on holiday, have care obligations, teaching, marking deadlines, right? Any number of different personal and professional obligations that may be pressing on their time in addition to contributing to this volume. So you may need to discuss with them. I would suggest doing it proactively to see if those times suit them. And also crucially remembering that the deadline for the press you need to submit the revised manuscript may not necessarily be the same deadline you have where you need to receive the drafts from contributors in order to compile and collate it once again into kind of a final manuscript. A key warning or something to keep in mind anyways is that as with peer-reviewed articles, you do not need to make every change suggested by the reviewer, right? They are suggestions, recommendations. That said, if you decide not to make any changes based upon certain reviewer comments, you will need to provide justification for why you've not made those changes, right? And depending on the publisher and their kind of preferred way of mediating this conversation, this discussion, it may be a response, an annotated response on the actual manuscript itself, where the issue has been raised, or maybe explaining a covering letter you submit with your kind of manuscript, your revised manuscript as well. But again, the editor will confirm the best approach or what's suitable for them in-house. Finally, you've submitted the manuscript. What lies ahead for you now? So hopefully the publish deadline has arrived and it's either ready to go or you've run out of time. You just need to submit whatever you have now. Either way, it's off your desk again. Fantastic. What happens next in the submission process? So following submission, you will generally stop working with the commissioning editor anymore. Their role is done because again, their job is to commission things. It is not to work on typesetting, proofreading, or marketing, right? So you will generally be introduced to new members of the press or for the publisher to help you with those aspects of it. So again, you will be put in contact with the production team. They will help you with different typesetting, format, style, placement of figures, all that kind of more fine-tuned details when it comes to setting up the proofs. So that's the kind of next issue, moving from manuscript drafts into actual proofs now. And the proofs will become more sophisticated and look more like final publishable material as you advance down that pathway. And it will take multiple months of different proofs they typically have very tight turnaround times, I will say. So when it came to the book that again that Kate and I just published, I think the every 2 weeks there's a new proof being submitted for us for comment clarification. And we had about a week to turn around and respond to that. So just keep that in mind, because again, you might have other publications you're working on, other team-based commitments, or other personal commitments as well, sort of things. So just be mindful that when those come in, you have some time set aside to actually be able to address um, the production team's comments as well. At that point in time, depending on the publisher, a lot of publishers do have an in-house marketing team that will actually help you market the book as well. Um, they will often help you set up kind of possibly book launches, social media campaigns to get the message out there. They might do press releases to popular press, BBC, Guardian, Sun, whoever it may be, whoever they think may have an audience for this book, if they think it has wider appeal beyond academia. But there'll be discussions that be had with the marketing team to figure out how best to proceed in getting your message out there by the book. That's that. Um, so that's kind of my overall synopsis and kind of the pathway from how you go from originally thinking about, do you want to write a book? If you do not write a book, how you write a proposal, or do you write the book first? How you choose a publisher? How you approach them? And actually, what's the process of actually proposing something to the publisher, writing the manuscripts, and actually getting it to the production team, and hopefully getting it published in not too long a time as well. That said, one thing I was asked to reflect upon is what I wish I had known before I started. So I have a few key things first. So my advice to you is that be warned. If you decide to edit a collection or book, you'll spend a lot of time chasing up your colleagues to submit their chapter. And that's because inevitably, as with everyone, we're all very busy individuals. We all have a lot of other priorities and obligations on our time, sort of thing as well. So we ourselves or people we're working with may miss deadlines for production or for even drafting the initial manuscript. It can be awkward and frustrating to have to repeatedly chase up your peers and colleagues, especially if they are senior to you when it comes to the hierarchy in higher education. Um, but ultimately, and it may not feel like at the time, but ultimately it will be rewarding once you actually have the book in hand, people are reading it, and they're giving you comments and feedback on it as well. But just to know that, that can be a very frustrating process when it actually is part of the production schedule and you feel like you're falling behind. And the editor tells you you're falling behind as well, sort of thing. Most books tend to have missed deadlines at some point in time, sort of thing. I think academic presses are used to that because again, we have so many things we're doing when it comes to teaching, administration, other research obligations as well, sort of thing. That's not uncommon, sort of thing. What Kate and I did when we missed some of our deadlines as well is just when we could see in that we weren't going to meet it, just proactively engage with our editor and say, look, we're not going to meet this deadline. We're waiting to hear from so and so. You know, here's a revised deadline. Let us know if this would work for you as well, sort of thing, right? So try to engage with them in the process rather than letting the deadline come and pass, sort of thing, and making them have to chase you up for the information. Don't do that. Be professional about how you're working with your editor as well. I mentioned this before a few slides ago near the beginning, but I cannot stress enough, work closely with series editors if you're going down the series route for publication, which again, I do highly recommend it because it is, a tried and tested way of people working in aging research, for instance, publishing in that field. But the series editors themselves are a fantastic resource to discuss your ideas, how you intend the scope of your book, the format of it as well, and also when something does go wrong, for instance, when you're missing dates, when you're having contributors not quite pulling their weight, or your co-author wants to pull out, there's an opportunity for you to discuss it with them to troubleshoot possible solutions without having to go directly to the more kind of editorial team, which kind of see more of the publishers sort of thing. So an opportunity to have a discussion with series editors who tend to be academics and are aware of all the issues that may arise when publishing in academia, to help solve it there before it goes higher up into the publishing house. And kind of the final suggestion I have for people, and something that I still try to do and struggle with sometimes as well, is try to write every day. I think it's a practice a lot of us get into when we're writing our thesis. I think that as we move into our post PhD work, whether it's postdoctoral, teaching, or anything else, sort of thing, we might tend to lose some of that time commitment, or setting aside that time is a bit more precious. That said, if you can discipline yourself, and if you have the opportunity, even because you don't have any obligations as well in your time, like care or anything else, to write every day, you will see much more marked progress over the same period of time than you will having to hurriedly write a draft before a near submission deadline. Um, so that's the only thing I suggest to you, is try to write every day as well, in addition to the possibilities and challenges of writing a book for the edited volume. Right. And just to close, again, for the last few minutes, I just wanted to give a tremendous thank you to Dr. Kate Hamblin, who really, in many ways, led the production of the book. I was brought on kind of the first few months of it. She was a fantastic colleague to work with, and you can definitely see how her leadership has really helped to make this such a great and also timely book to the field of care technologies and how we're understanding it too cross-culturally. And obviously, thank you to the contributors of the volume, and to our team at Bristol University Press, and of course to the ERA Organizing Committee for inviting me to have this talk with you today. So without further ado, thank you for your attention, and any questions for me?
Matthew, thank you so much. We are all just, there are lots of positive comments in here about how brilliant this is, really helpful. Everybody just feels like we've all learned a lot. So thank you so much. Before I open it up for questions, Mags Conroy had a question. Mags, do you want to just ask your question yourself?
Yeah. Hi, that was super practical and helpful, actually. Thank you so much. I can see why you'd have to have your contributors on board before you even put that proposal forward. But do authors get to the point where they've got all their contributors set up and they're all, raring to go, and then it just gets rejected out of hand, and you've got to go back to them all and say, I'm so sorry?
Yeah, it does happen.
That's
and
just...
also, yeah, it's just, I think the people who've been in academia for a while are used to that, because again, a lot of academia is rejection, whether it's publications, grant applications, right? You can develop a tough skin the longer you're in the game for, I think. But yeah, it is possible that you might have to go back to them and say it was rejected. But again, remember, it could be rejected on this occasion. You could then approach a different publisher instead, from Press House. You might decide, rather than doing an edited volume, you might want to do a special issue of a journal instead, and actually pursue that instead, right, as an alternative. So I think, don't lose hope. That there is scope for looking at alternative modes or outputs instead of doing an edited collection if it is rejected. But do keep in mind, then, publishers really need to publish books, right? That's how they make their income. So they are interested in things. So long as it looks like a reasonably high quality, I think the most difficult thing is can you herd the cats of other academics into actually finishing the thing? Right? Is it actually feasible to actually finish the product, sort of thing? Because a lot of people drop out due to other obligations, they're moving jobs, they're leaving academia entirely to do work elsewhere, sort of thing, right? So I think the hardest thing actually is getting it to completion. I think the proposals, if they are reasonably coherent, again, if you work with a series editor beforehand, before you submit the proposal, even more likely for it to be successful as well, then it will likely be submitted. In fact, I think it'd be more competitive actually if you're trying to do a special issue proposal, because again, special issues only have a finite number of issues they will publish in any volume of any given year, right? But an edit collection you can publish at any point in time. So I think don't lose hope if you are rejected the first time. There are alternative publishers or alternative formats you can also pursue as well.
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks for the question, though.
Matthew, there are further questions. Junji, do you want to start? And then Arland?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. This is really helpful, like everyone already noticed. I have two questions, and I will give the opportunity to others. And if there is more time, I will ask more questions. Yeah, so the first thing I want to know about is, do you need, apart from the labor you need to spend to prepare all these kind of tasks, do you need to pay anything to the editors or to the publisher? How much around that if you need to pay? And is that have you do you need to secure any funding to support this? And if and where you can go for those funding resources? So this is the first question, and maybe I would let you respond to it first.
Sure. So I will say, great question, Junji. And it is, the answer is no, typically you do not have to pay for anything to be published. The only condition where that would change is if you want to be published open access. Right. So this, if we just had it in this format alone, it'd be fine. We don't have to pay anything to publish at all. Because we also wanted to be published as an open access PDF, it means we paid a fee. I can't remember how much it cost. It was several £1,000s though. But again, we often have to pay that for open access fees for journal articles as well, so it's not unheard of. If you are externally funded, you can use money from that. So for instance, if you are funded by UKRI expects most publications now to be open access, even if that means a monograph or edited collection. So you will type either drop on funding from a UKRI, again, ESRC, MRC, AHRC, whoever is funding you. Also, universities should have access to money as well to pay for open access fees as well. So talk to your research director in your school or department. They may know who to talk to. If not, they will signpost you to your research development team or whoever that's called at your university as well, more centrally, who should be able to help you out answering this question sort of thing. But typically you don't have to pay anything unless you want to be open access. Obviously, open access has advantages because it means anyone can read your work, which also can increase your citations, increase your H index, right? So for your career, it can be really beneficial to have it be open access, but it need not be. And your second question is?
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. The second question I want to ask is about the marketing, because once we have all these work out, we of course we want this to reach as many audience as possible, right? So do you have any kind of suggestions on this, and do you have any plans for your book, for example, the launching events or any social media kind of communications or other kind of things to promote the work you have done?
Another great question, thanks. And I think this will vary from publisher to publisher who you're working with, right? So Bristol University Press has a marketing department who have been pretty good. I'll say, this is being recorded. What do I say? They could have been a bit more proactive earlier on, perhaps. So one thing I requested, for instance, early on, and we eventually did receive it about a week or two ago, right before the book was published, basically, it's just a little banner to put in our signature of our email, just so other people can click on an image of the book and be brought right to the open access version of it, right? So that's a kind of way of, whenever I send up my full signature to people, they can see that is a recent publication. And it looks more attractive than just having kind of the Harvard referencing style kind of citation instead listed there. So that's one way they do it. They have tweeted a few things. They've done a book giveaway as well. People are retweeting information as well. So they have done that. When it comes to book launch, we don't have anything formally set up yet. I think one point in time, Kate and I were thinking about doing something for Transforming Care because it's a care conference. Our book's about care and technologies. It's at Sheffield, which Kate Hamblin is still currently based at institutionally, so it makes sense. But I think there's just too many other things going on right now when it comes to, set up the new Center for Care, the new Implementation Center. I'm going to be in Australia during Transforming Care, so that won't really help that cause either. That said, so because I am in Australia, I'm going there to attend the International Sociological Association World Congress. So I will be bringing copies of the book with me there to kind of flog shamelessly around because I'm doing a panel on care technologies and aging. So I thought that's an appropriate thing to bring to everyone's attention while I'm there. But again, it's not really a formal book launch per se, but it is an opportunity to still share that information. Once I get back from my travels later in the summer, in case work is kind of settled down too with her obligations, we might consider more kind of formal book launch as well. Don't know where it'll be, Sheffield or Bristol most likely, given where we're based institutionally. But I will let you know and BSG ERA know once that happens.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Arlen, did you have a question? Thank you for that, Matthew. Really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. I thought it was actually so good to hear step by step and to just get that complete overview. I didn't expect that, to be honest. I thought it would be, yeah, just maybe an overview. And this was such a good surprise to get everything and to get all the information. So again, I feel like this was a wonderful ERA event. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And my question is more about the time, because I know sometimes people go on sabbatical just to write a book, or how did you manage your kind of, yeah, just your time, because you're probably lecturing, researching, writing, you know, yeah, just can you just tell us a bit more about that? How is that feasible?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the reality is that you have to fit in with the other obligations on your time, right? So when I originally agreed to be the co-editor with Kate, I was a 100% research postdoctoral fellow at University of Sheffield. Obviously, I then moved to a lecturing, academic and teaching, research and teaching role at University of Bristol when we were first kind of waiting for the first drafts to come in from our contributors. So it means I had to kind of prioritize this as my kind of research outputs for the years it took me to do this, which means, compared to some of my colleagues, it means I probably have fewer peer-reviewed articles because I was working on getting this thing ready and out to the publisher. That said, now that's out now, it feels very gratifying to have it in hand and that people can read it and getting really good feedback from academics, also people from policy and practice, crucially too, who are actually reading it, which is a great. But yeah, it means when you have other obligation time, maybe administration things in your department, maybe teaching things, it kind of does narrow down what you can produce in that time when it comes to your research outputs. And I chose to still go ahead with this and work on that. And originally it was meant to be, so okay, let me think this now. We were meant to have it published about this time last year. So about a year after I started working in Bristol. However, due to delays with some of the contributors, some delays when it came to production as well, it's taken a full year for it to actually come to fruition. So I would say that it feels laborious and it's just in a very abstract way sort of thing, but actually the amount of time it can take is a lot. And it is an opportunity cost, right? Because it means you're not able to produce something else sort of thing. So if you have a finite amount of time, I will say that if you're working in the UK, is it the best thing for you to publish a book? Possibly not. There's a lot more capital in publishing a peer-reviewed journal article when it comes to things like the ref, for instance. That said, if you are certain disciplines like sociology, social anthropology, or kind of humanistic side of thing of gerontology and aging research, the prize expectation to get a lecturing post or to be promoted to senior lecturer, you'll need to have a book at some point in time. I mean, maybe a monograph, maybe a collection, maybe a combination of both of them. We need to have something at some point in time for those kind of book-driven disciplines. But if you're not in one of those, if you're more on the kind of more statistical side or quantitative side of doing things, it's unlikely that a book will help you with progression or promotion. So I say, talk to your mentors about how they advise you, if they would advise you to publish a book sort of thing, and realize that, it means that you have to give up on other opportunities instead to make sure that it comes to fruition though.
Thank you, Matthew. That was really helpful. Does anyone else have any other questions? Or do we all want to go on to, oh, sorry, Junji, go ahead.
If there is no more questions, then I'm coming. Okay. So the other question I want to ask is about managing the contributors from your book, because we know they're so diverse. They come from different countries and working in different kind of culture, and they have different ethos of writing things. So as you just mentioned, some of the delays already been observed during the process. So what kind of your insights of managing these, and do you have any advice to to make sure the contributors are dedicated to or commissioned to the deadlines, and they really will give some good kind of work back to you. To be honest, this morning I just submitted one book chapter together with my colleagues, and today is the deadline. So I'm sure the editors will be happy to receive it just on the deadline. But of course, if I can imagine if our work being delayed, there will be lots of frustrations that go to the editor's side.
Yeah. And there are frustrations at all different levels, right? So the production team and publishers are frustrated because they're expecting books to a point in time for help with marketing it, right? To help with make sure that gets out to retailers. I was surprised when I first published, or first time my book was coming out in May. The first group I saw it being published with was available on Target in the US. So like one, the fact that it was available in the US was bizarre to me. But the fact that it would be available at Target, I'm like, who's gonna buy this on the shelf in a department store in the US? Hopefully no one. Again, it's open access. But also it's also frustrating to you as editors because you're reliant on these people as well. And also crucially, it's really upsetting to you as editors when you know that it's letting down other contributors, right? So we have some contributors who always met every single deadline. And we know that they were being delayed with having their work available to be read and cited and referenced and discussed because some other contributors were delayed and were not meeting the deadlines as well. So that is really frustrating to deal with. How much you kind of go into? I will say that there were some contributors who were very difficult and failed to meet many deadlines. One way in which that could be prevented, and knowing this now in the future, is be very selective about who you choose to contribute to your edited volume, right? Either if you know colleagues who know them, kind of have informal discussions about, like, has it been working with this person in the past, how they delivered on time and as well, sort of thing. You may feel that if they continue to miss deadlines, you may need to involve their line manager or their head of school, which is a very uncomfortable conversation to have. And also it's very uncomfortable for them as well, reputationally for them, not only their commitment to the field, but also in their own institution, because now you're involving someone above their head too, because I'm delivering things. So it can be very difficult. It's one of the things where after doing this edit collection, I'm not in any rush to do an edit collection again, I'll say. My next book will probably be a research monograph, sole authored, because I can manage my own time commitments, my own other obligations. That said, there's no way I could have done the policy analysis in Australia, Japan, Canada, and Germany without the contributors from those respective countries, right? So it is novel in that way. I wouldn't be able to do this work any other way without their kind of contribution. It was delayed, it was frustrating, it was agonizing at times, sort of thing, but ultimately it's done. And I think that's something to keep in mind, like the process itself is like, it will be difficult, it will be stressful. But when it is completed, one, if it doesn't go very well, you're not obligated to work with them ever again, right? You got the book, you got the chapter, job's done. You can move on with your career, your own life, sort of thing too. But at least you have something to show for that agonizing experience. So that's what I recommend is try to get almost like people vouching for their character professionally, but also recognizing that you may not know they're difficult until you're a year into working with them, and you may need to have different conversations with them, including with the publisher, including with the series editors, including with their line manager or head of department, sort of thing. But it may be what's required in order to get them to ultimately deliver what they've contractually agreed to do, right? So when you sign it as the editor, the contributors also sign a contract as well, sort of thing. So they are also obligated to fulfill that contract too. And also another thing you might consider too is that the people you originally agreed to contribute to, they may need to drop out, either because you asked them to, because they're not delivering, or because, sudden illness, death in the family, sort of thing, they may not be able to meet obligations too, right? So you may need to figure out if you can then continue with the project still, the collection, or if you needed to identify possible additional contributors instead. So it's one thing we were considering as well for one of our chapters is whether we needed to add an additional colleague we knew who could deliver on time, so we worked with him in the past, to support one of the chapters, and we're redrafting it because of the quality that we received for the final draft was still not quite up to scratch. Thankfully, we were able to kind of help support the writer to that final phase, but we did consider about adding additional authors in at that kind of endpoint, just to make sure we could make a submissible manuscript for the publisher. So yeah, I don't really have any kind of firm guidance there, but they're just things to be aware of, sort of thing, how you might troubleshoot or address some of the challenges that may arise to doing edited collection in particular. Again, if you do a single sole authored thing, none of these are really issues because it's just kind of managing your own workload, your own expectations, your own obligations, sort of thing. So in some ways that is beneficial route. And again, if you're an early career researcher who's published their who's finished their PhD, the most straightforward thing to publish as a book is your doctoral thesis and adapting that into a monograph, right? Which again, maybe just published by you. You might throw a bone to your supervisors and invite them to be co-authors with you. If that's kind of what's expected in your kind of discipline. I know people from like engineering or health sciences often have more kind of co-authored kind of expectations with supervisors. If you're from more kind of sociology, social anthropology, it tends to be more single-authored. So that might be a point to discuss with a mentor or with their former supervisor as well, sort of thing. But again, sole-authored monograph route is much more straightforward and generally also has a much more kind of capital as well. Edit collections are fine. I liked doing this in the end. But when it comes to your career ambitions and promotion and progression, a single authored research monograph has much more clout to it than edit collection does as well. So that's something else to keep in mind as well.
But I also heard, Matthew, I heard this from a colleague. She published a monograph in kind of more popular science with a more popular science publisher, and she's actually making money from this book. Like, this is, I think, maybe another interesting route, right? To write it up for kind of everyone.
Yeah, which is why I included information about like Penguin, for instance, right? Because I think one thing to think about is who's your intended audience, and it may be other academics, maybe policymakers, in our case, people involved in practice as well, right? So as you work in health and social care contexts, or engineering or technology development, could be them as well as kind of that community of practice too. It may just be an interested public. That's fine. I don't see it as any less valuable for knowledge production. That said, I'm not necessarily on the hiring committee or promotion committee for your university, so they may disagree with that notion. But I still see that as a useful way of kind of communicating ideas with the interested public. So indeed, if one of the things we're being judged on is research impact, how is engaging an interested public, a broad general public, not impactful work? I would see that it is. In fact, yeah. So yeah, that's why. Sorry, my soapbox for that. I agree with you entirely, Arlen, there. And also, if you are not part of and live in the UK, if you're not part of the Society for Authors, do join that if you publish anything peer-reviewed or any books or anything like that in the UK. So what is they will chase up people who have published your work or used your work in any way, and they will give you money twice a year. It's not a lot, I will say, but I've only published a handful of things because actually the book just came out recently. And I've gotten probably about £500 from them in the last year and a half. Which again, it's not a lot of money sort of thing, right? It's not, I'm not gonna be the next J.K. Rowling or anything like that when it comes to buying a castle or anything like that. But it is something that you don't anticipate. Because oftentimes when we do the writing we do in academia in particular, it's going to be kind of just part of our contracted hours, right? And something that we give kind of as part of that kind of salaried time sort of thing. So giving any little bit popped up there is really nice. So I can send the link to the ERA team, and maybe they can pass on that link to you. Because if you are based in the UK, I highly recommend you join that, because again, money given away is always nice given the financial pressures.
Well, thank you again, Matthew. It's really just been such a wonderful presentation, given us so much information. And again, just incredible respect. It's not just being a writer that you are, you're the organizer, you're the person behind them, gently pushing. Amazing work, and congratulations on your book. That's just really wonderful. Now, we do have a few minutes, and as you recall, this is a G&T, and you mentioned you had some sort of cocktail that you were interested in.
So, and this is where I'm going to apologize now, because I haven't made a cocktail today because I've been working on presentation this afternoon, and also I have to do more work after this as well, so I probably ought not to be turning to hard liquor at this time of the day, given that I'll be commenting on students' ethics applications, which feels a bit unethical actually, to maybe do that slightly tipsy. But I will say that my preferred cocktail, I'll have it on record now, is something called the Godfather, and it's just a mix of whiskey and an amaretto liqueur. So the sweetness of the amaretto really takes the edge off the smokiness of some whiskey sort of things too. So I highly encourage people to look it up. I think, did I send you a recipe for it at all? It's a really simple recipe. It really is just kind of 2 measures
I think
of
it's
each
on
liqueur
the
sort of thing mixed together.
Eventbrite. Yeah, I think we're all set with that. So it sounds great, Matthew. Since none of us are drinking, I will toast you with mint tea. So suitably non-alcoholic. And just again, thank you everyone for joining us. Just in case nobody you need the information, there's further information about the ERA pre-conference. And we'll look forward to seeing you all there. And thank you again, Matthew. It was just superb.